The hospital wing smelled of singed cloth, didn't he? And the cold mineral breath of the castle after rain. Harry sat hunched beside Ginny Weasley's bed with dried blood cracking at the edge of his sleeve, and the bone-deep tremor of somebody who had kept moving far past the point where fear should have dropped him. Madame Pomfrey had tried twice to send him away, and twice had discovered that a look could be as stubborn as a locked door. In the end, she had done what sensible people were often forced to do around Harry Potter, and accepted the unreasonable as though it were weather. Ginny lay very still against the whiteness of the pillows. All the dangerous flush drained from her face now, leaving her young and freckled and heartbreakingly ordinary. That was what undid him more than the memory of the great scaled body in the chamber below, more than the shred of Tom Riddle's smile disappearing into nothing. Evil was easier to think about when it wore a monstrous shape. It was worse, somehow, to look at a girl who ought to have been worrying about holiday homework, and realize that something ancient and clever had hollowed out a place inside her and spoken with her voice. Across the room, in a bed that had only just been stripped, the indent of Hermione's convalescence was still visible in the mattress. Justin Finch-Fletchley's mother had wept over her son half an hour before and had gone away with her face veiled and her mouth set in a line that suggested the governors of Hogwarts would not enjoy their summer. Colin Creevy's camera, dented and ruined, sat on a side table like a tiny mechanical corpse. The basilisk had petrified students, terrified the school, and driven one man to Azkaban. The chamber had done damage far beyond stone and scale. Harry could feel it in the silence itself, a bruised, listening hush that kept spreading through the castle, searching for more places to settle. Dumbledore moved through that hush as though it parted for him. He had changed out of his traveling cloak, but there was still road dust silvering the hem of his robes, and his beard had caught a few droplets from the weather outside. He did not seem diminished by suspension. If anything, his return had given him the kind of calm that looked almost like kindness until one saw the watchfulness beneath it. He spoke softly to Madame Pomfrey, rested a hand for a brief moment on Hagrid's shoulder, where the gamekeeper stood blubbering near the door, and crossed at last to Harry and Ginny. "You have done more than enough for one night," he said. Harry's mouth was so dry it hurt. "Is she?" "She will wake," Dumbledore said. And though the words were simple, they seemed to take hold in the room like an enchantment. Her strength was terribly drained, but youth is a resilient thing. Miss Weasley will recover. "Nani?" McGonagall, standing in the shadow of a bed curtain with both hands locked so tightly around her wand, it was a wonder the wood did not crack, shut her eyes once and let out a breath through her nose. Some of the iron in her face softened. "The parents have been sent for," she said, "and the board has been informed that the school is safe." At that, a sound rose from the corridor outside. Brisk steps, a murmur, the scrape of somebody reluctant to slow when everybody else had decided he ought to. A moment later, Cornelius Fudge came in with the sheen of rain still on his bottle-green cloak, and all the air of a man who had prepared himself for outrage and discovered instead something more inconvenient. He stopped just inside the doorway. Perhaps he had expected disorder, screaming children, accusations, a dramatic scene fit for tomorrow's prophet. Instead, he found a handful of exhausted people and a line of empty beds in a room that seemed too clean for what had happened beneath the castle. Fudge's eyes went first to Dumbledore, then to Harry, and then to the red-haired girl in the bed. Something quick and private crossed his face. Alarm, calculation, pity. Harry was too tired to sort it. "My dear girl," Fudge said automatically, though Ginny's eyes were still closed. "Dear me, dear me." Madame Pomfrey stiffened. "If you are here to question patience, Minister, you may go and question the portraits. They have had a longer night than any child in this room." Fudge gave her the wary look people gave witches whose authority had no title but plenty of force. "No, no, of course not. I'm merely here to ascertain, well, the facts." "No, the facts," said McGonagall, "may wait until the children can stand upright." Fudge flushed beneath the damp curl of his side whiskers. Naturally. But one can understand the concern. A monster in the school, the headmaster absent, the board in chaos, parents already preparing letters. Concern, Dumbledore said. And haste are cousins, but not twins. Let us not mistake one for the other. The minister's mouth tightened, not with anger so much as fatigue. Harry saw it then, that Fudge was afraid. Not of the basilisk. That danger was dead. Not even, at bottom, of what had happened to Ginny. He was afraid of what happened next, of responsibility unfolding in paperwork and public opinion, of the ugly mathematics by which fear became blame and blame sought a name at the top of a ministry letterhead. Before he could answer, the flue in the adjoining office roared green, and the room changed all at once. Molly Weasley stumbled out first in a swirl of soot and knitwear, one hand still gripping the grate, the other already reaching blindly forward as though her daughter might be somewhere in the smoke. Arthur came after her with a face so white Harry scarcely knew him. The moment Molly saw Ginny, she made a sound so raw that every adult in the room stepped back from it. She crossed to the bed in 3 quick strides and sank down, gathering Ginny's thin hand between both of hers. "Oh, my baby. Oh, my darling girl." Arthur stood beside her, looking not at Ginny at first, but at Harry. It was not accusation. Harry would have known that. It was the gaze of a man assembling, piece by piece, the impossible shape of the thing that had nearly taken his child and left her gone from the world while her body remained. He put a hand on Harry's shoulder, squeezed once, and then bent over Ginny. Dumbledore drew Fudge back toward the windows, granting the family a fragment of privacy that felt, in such a room, almost sacred. Outside, rain blurred the grounds into dark washes of green and slate. Somewhere beyond the glass, the lake moved like a patient beast. The castle itself seemed to be listening. "You arrested Hagrid," Dumbledore said quietly. Fudge looked miserable. "On the evidence available. On the evidence convenient. I acted under pressure, as men often do," Dumbledore said. "The question is what sort of men they become once they have done it." For a moment, Fudge said nothing. The rain beat at the panes. Then he turned, lowered his voice, and asked, "Can you swear this is ended, Albus?" Dumbledore's gaze rested on the dark gardens below. "The basilisk is dead. Tom Riddle's instrument is destroyed. The chamber has no master now." No, that is not what I asked." "No," Dumbledore agreed. "You asked for certainty." Fudge's hands moved restlessly over the clasp of his cloak. "A school cannot be run on mysteries. Not after this. Not when children have been attacked inside the walls. Not when families will ask what the ministry knew and what the ministry did." Before he could answer, Ginny moved just then. A small involuntary turn of the head against the pillow. Molly gasped. Arthur made a broken, hopeful sound. Harry shot to his feet so quickly his stool skidded backward across the floor. Ginny's lashes fluttered. Her eyes opened by degrees, unfocused first, then widening with the terrible confusion of someone waking into a world that had not agreed to be kind. She saw her mother, and the confusion broke. "Mom," she whispered, and then seeing Harry over Molly's shoulder, she flinched as though memory had reached out and touched her. "I'm sorry," she said at once, and her voice was a shred. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." Molly bent over her, crying openly. "Hush, hush, none of that." But Ginny's gaze had gone beyond her, searching the room in panic, as though she expected to see writing on the walls, or hear the slick whisper of scales beneath stone. "It was him," she said. "He made me. There was a diary, I wrote in it, and he answered, and then I couldn't remember things and—" "Enough," said Madame Pomfrey with surprising gentleness. "No more tonight." Fudge took one involuntary step forward. "A diary?" McGonagall's head turned. "Minister." The single word carried enough warning to stop him. He cleared his throat. "Yes. Well, naturally. Later then." "Nuncia." "Ginny, spent by even those few words, sagged back into the pillows. Molly stroked her hair. Arthur closed his eyes with an expression that was almost pain. Harry, standing at the bedside with his hands balled uselessly at his sides, felt rage begin to move again beneath his exhaustion. Not the clean rage of battle, but the cold one, the one with memory in it. A diary, a book, something handed from one person to another like nothing at all. Lucius Malfoy. The name had hardly formed when there came a disturbance in the corridor. Silk against stone, a hissed exchange, then the pointed tap of a cane. Lucius appeared in the doorway with Draco at his shoulder, elegant even in displeasure, his pale face composed into a civility that failed to conceal the fury underneath. He had not expected to find a room full of witnesses, still less the Weasleys and the minister standing within earshot of whatever he might wish to say. "Headmaster," he said, and if the title carried a grain of bitterness, nobody could miss it. "I had understood this matter was concluded." "It is," said Dumbledore, "though perhaps not in the manner you had hoped." Harry felt the diary, destroyed now, empty and ruined, like a memory against his hand. Dobby's sock had done its work in the corridor outside not 10 minutes earlier, and the house elf had vanished in tears of gratitude, leaving Lucius publicly thwarted, privately exposed. Draco looked pale with humiliation. Lucius looked murderous. His eyes landed on Harry with a softness more threatening than any shout. "Let us hope," he said, "that Mr. Potter will always be around to save the day." "Nay, Dunda." Before Harry could answer, Dumbledore stepped between them with such quiet precision that the movement felt premeditated. "You will leave this room," he said, "and you will remember, Lucius, that kindness withheld in private has a habit of becoming visible in public." Lucius's nostrils thinned. For one instant, Harry thought he might do something reckless. Instead, he inclined his head a fraction too far, took Draco by the shoulder, and turned away. As he passed Fudge, the minister drew aside almost imperceptibly, making room without seeming to. Harry saw it. Dumbledore saw it. Perhaps Fudge himself saw it because color rose in his cheeks after Lucius had gone. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Molly made another small broken sound as Ginny's fingers tightened weakly around hers, and the world rushed back into its ordinary order of urgent things. Much later, when the parents had been settled, when Madame Pomfrey had bullied Harry into drinking something hot that tasted of herbs and metal, when the rain had thinned to a whisper along the windows, Cornelius Fudge stood alone for a minute beside the door and looked back across the ward. Children in beds. Teachers who had failed to look rested though they stood. A headmaster who seemed answerable to no one yet could not prevent disaster. A famous boy with a blood-stained shirt. A frightened family clinging to one another in a room lit as gently as a chapel. Fudge's expression altered, not into hardness exactly, but into something set. He was not a cruel man. That was the trouble. Cruel men sometimes moved too quickly and showed their shape. Cornelius Fudge was a frightened man who wished to be thought prudent, and frightened, prudent men could alter the world by inches while still believing themselves its guardians. When he left the hospital wing, he took the smell of Dittany with him and the conviction, newly planted and already rooting, that next time the ministry would not stand outside Hogwarts and wait to be told what had happened. By morning the rain had passed, leaving the castle washed and deceptively serene. Sunlight spread in pale gold bars across the spiral stairs to the headmaster's office, across the suits of armor and the framed landscapes and the still damp flags hanging from the rafters above the entrance hall. It touched everything with innocence and changed nothing. The governors assembled before breakfast. Harry knew because the castle, like every old place with too many portraits and too many opinions, did not keep secrets well when those secrets wore official robes. A house elf had been seen carrying up an extra silver service. 2 owls from the ministry had arrived before dawn. Filch had polished the brass knob to the headmaster's office until it shone like accusation. By the time Harry, Ron, and Hermione hovered near the foot of the spiral stairs under the pretense of being interested in a tapestry, half the school seemed to know that something decisive was happening above them. "Do you think they'll close the school?" Ron asked, trying to sound as though it would not matter to him if they did. "Hermione," still pale from her months as a statue and far too awake for breakfast time, folded her arms. "They can't," she said. But her certainty did not ring true. "Not after everything." "After everything is usually when people do stupid things," Harry said. He had slept barely 3 hours, and had woken with Lucius Malfoy's soft threat still echoing in him. Something had shifted last night. He could not yet name it, only feel the drag of it under the skin of the morning. Hogwarts had survived monsters before. He was sure of that. But survival, he was beginning to understand, did not mean being left alone. From above them came the muted rise and fall of voices. Harry looked at the spiral staircase, judged the distance, and decided that if he could face a basilisk, he could risk a little overhearing. It took Hermione half a second to realize what he meant, and Ron almost none at all. 3 cloaked in Harry's invisibility cloak would have been impossible, but 2 could manage badly, and badly was sometimes enough. Hermione hissed that it was reckless. Ron hissed back that was why it might work. In the end, Hermione came too, because good sense followed Harry around the way a harassed parent followed a pyromaniac. They crept up 3 turns of the staircase and crouched on a landing where the office door stood not quite closed. Voices moved clearly through the gap. "I need not remind anyone present," said Fudge, "that the ministry is already under severe scrutiny over the handling of this business. There are questions in the prophet. There are parents demanding assurances." "Nigga." "Assurances," said Dumbledore, "are cheap to write and expensive to honor." Lucius's voice answered, smooth as polished bone. "Then let us provide the sort that can be honored, Headmaster. No one doubts your gifts, but gifts are not governance." Through the sliver of space, Harry could see a corner of the office. The claw-footed table near the windows, a bowl of lemon drops untouched, one of the silver instruments spinning gently as though nervous. McGonagall stood behind Dumbledore's chair, black-robed and rigid. Fudge sat opposite, dabbing occasionally at his brow with a folded handkerchief despite the coolness of the morning. Lucius was not seated at all. He moved only when he wished to draw the eye, and every movement accomplished it. A which Harry did not know. One of the governors, by the jeweled badge at her throat, said, "My granddaughter was petrified for months. I was sent notes saying all was under control. It was not under control." "No one disputes the gravity," said McGonagall. "On the contrary," Lucius said mildly. "I believe the issue is that too many people have attempted to dispute it for too long." Dumbledore's eyes, visible now as he turned slightly, rested on him. "And some, perhaps, have cultivated it." Lucius smiled without showing teeth. "You imply a great deal and prove little." "I have found," Dumbledore replied, "that proof has a way of arriving after people have already profited." For an instant the room sharpened. Fudge shifted in his chair. The Governor Witch looked from one man to the other, and then quickly away, as if she had realized she was present at a dinner where the knives were not ornamental. Cornelius cleared his throat. "Let us keep to practicalities. The school cannot be closed indefinitely. That much is obvious. Yet neither can it simply reopen in September as though nothing has occurred. The public would never stand for it." "What do you propose?" McGonagall asked. There was the faintest pause, and in it, Harry heard the hinge on which the whole meeting turned. "A review," Fudge said. "Temporary. Limited. A joint safety review conducted by the board in consultation with the ministry. Recommendations concerning student welfare, staff preparedness, access to restricted areas, cursed objects, all of that sort of thing." "Nah." "Consultation," Dumbledore repeated. "Yes. With what authority?" "Only advisory to begin with." "To begin with," Dumbledore said, and Harry knew from the stillness in his voice that he had heard the more honest phrase inside the lie. Lucius drifted closer to the desk. "Surely a confident institution does not fear scrutiny." "A confident institution," said McGonagall, "recognizes when scrutiny is a synonym employed by the ambitious." One of the other governors, an elderly wizard with a walrus mustache and tired eyes, spoke up before Lucius could retort. "Minerva, with respect, some scrutiny is due. We suspended Albus under pressure because we believed action necessary. I, for one, would prefer not to be blackmailed into future decisions by panic or rumor. That silenced the room more effectively than if he had shouted. Lucius's expression did not change, but the tendons in his jaw showed briefly under the skin. Fudge pounced on the opening. Exactly. A structure, procedures, proper channels. If something occurs, the ministry must know at once, not after months of rumor. Something did occur, Dumbledore said. A child was manipulated through a dark object introduced into the school from outside. Lucius folded his hands behind his back. An allegation. A truth. Then offer it to the Wizengamot. Dumbledore's gaze held his. When I have proof that cannot be smothered by money and pedigree, I shall. Harry felt Hermione beside him tense hard enough to tremble. Ron, who could not hear every word but knew the shape of a duel when he saw one, made a furious sound under his breath. The Governor Witch said more quietly, now, Albus, what would reassure parents? Dumbledore leaned back. Sunlight touched the half-moons of his spectacles and hid his eyes for a moment. Truth, he said. Humility. Better warding of dangerous artifacts, if you insist. More careful channels of communication. But not the slow surrender of this school to people who will mistake paperwork for wisdom. No. Fudge's handkerchief snapped once between his fingers. No one is talking about surrender. Lucius turned the phrase over like a coin. No, merely accountability. From somewhere high in the office, one of the portraits muttered. Same thing when the wrong man says it, and received a hiss for silence from another frame. The meeting went on for nearly an hour. Words such as transparency and duty and confidence were used so often they began to sound like a language created for the purpose of concealing motives rather than revealing them. Yet beneath all the varnish, the shape of the matter remained plain. Parents were frightened. The ministry was embarrassed. Lucius meant to convert both into leverage. Fudge did not want control so much as he wanted not to be blamed again. Dumbledore knew this and knew also that refusing every compromise would hand his enemies the one thing they lacked, a spectacle. At last he said, Very well. Harry's heart lurched. Beside him, Hermione inhaled sharply. Very well, Dumbledore repeated. Conduct your review. Send your letters. Ask your questions. But understand this, Cornelius. Fear is an appetite. If you feed it authority, it will return hungry. Fudge looked relieved enough to mistake the warning for agreement. Excellent. Sensible. Entirely sensible. Lucius inclined his head as though he had merely won a point in a debate too refined for emotion. But Harry saw the satisfaction under the courtesy. It gleamed there, cold as morning steel. The governors rose. Chairs scraped. Wax seals were pressed to parchment. The meeting had the dry, tidy sounds by which institutions convinced themselves they had created order, when in fact they had only distributed influence. Harry, Ron, and Hermione scrambled backward down the stairs before the door opened. They had just reached the tapestry when Lucius emerged below the office arch and descended with measured steps, his cloak whispering over the stone. He did not see them. Fudge followed, still talking in low tones about wording and public confidence. McGonagall came last, stopped halfway down the staircase and looked directly at the place where Harry stood concealed. You may as well go to breakfast, she said into empty air. And if I discover that any of you have missed eggs for eavesdropping, I shall give detentions grave enough to be remembered in family history. Harry's ears burned. The cloak shifted as they untangled themselves. Ron muttered that she must have smelled him. Hermione went scarlet. McGonagall's mouth twitched once, almost against her will. By noon, the first owls had gone out. They rose from the owlery in disciplined bursts, carrying letters stamped with the school seal, with the board's crest, with the minister's neat green flourish. Harry watched them from the courtyard and felt, though he could not yet have explained why, that something older than the letters had been set in flight with them. Hogwarts was not being conquered. Not yet. It was being made answerable. It was being discussed, measured, and translated into the language of management by people who would never understand why stone staircases changed direction, when offended, or why a school could be safest when it still had room for trust. Above him the owls wheeled once and vanished into the washed blue of the day. Summer came heavy and green. At the Burrow the grass grew faster than reason. The hens were forever underfoot, and the kitchen smelled most days of warm bread, onions frying in butter, and the peculiar sweet sharp scent of enchanted washing taking itself too personally on the line. To any outsider it would have looked like the sort of home fear could not find. But fear, as Molly Weasley discovered, was not discouraged by clutter or love. Sometimes it entered more easily where both were plentiful. Ginny moved through July like a girl learning her own weight anew. She was not ill in the ordinary sense. Madame Pomfrey's restorative potions had done their work. Color returned to her cheeks. Appetite came and went. Sleep came badly, but it came. She laughed sometimes when Fred and George performed, though the sound often stopped too soon. She could still fly. She could still set a table with a flick of her wand and roll her eyes at Percy when he talked about standards. Yet there were moments, an ink bottle uncapped too long, a blank page left open on the table, the faint scratch of a quill in another room, when all the lights seemed to go out behind her face, and she stood as still as a listening deer. Molly learned to move quietly around diaries. The first Prophet editorial arrived folded inside Arthur's lunch pail. He brought it home by accident, or perhaps not by accident at all. Some things men laid on the table because they wanted them shared. This one declared, beneath a headline about safeguarding the next generation, that the independence of Hogwarts governance had been tested and found wanting. It praised the minister's commitment to review. It mentioned parental confidence, coordination with the board, and the need for common sense oversight. Lucius Malfoy was not named. He did not need to be. His habits showed in the article the way expensive scent lingered after the wearer had left. Molly read it standing at the sink, then smoothed it once on the scrubbed wood and said, in a voice so calm it made Arthur look up at once, "If that man breathes near my children again, I'll hex the skin off him." Arthur rubbed a hand over his mouth. His spectacles had slid low on his nose. Soot marked one cuff where some ministry grate had spit at him. "It isn't only him." "No," Molly said. "That is what worries me." Percy, who had come into the kitchen with a stack of timetables and a head boy's importance already beginning to cling to him like starch, glanced at the paper. "Well, there's nothing unreasonable in a review," he said. "After last year, people will expect one." Fred, upside down on a chair by the hearth, snorted. "People also expect ministry memos whenever someone sneezes after curfew. Doesn't make it wise." George, shelling peas with malicious efficiency, added, "Percy would have us all wear numbered badges in the loo if the minister said it improved standards." "It might improve some people's standards," Percy said pointedly. Arthur held up a hand before the twins could rise to the bait. He looked tired, and in the tiredness there was something else now. A strain Molly had begun to recognize whenever Cornelius Fudge's name entered the house. Arthur liked people generally. He understood machinery, enchantments, loopholes, and the absurd dignity of muggle plugs. He did not enjoy politics, because politics involved too much pretending that motives were noble when everyone in the room could smell fear. "The review won't stop at letters," he said. "There's talk of a school safety subcommittee. Temporary, mind you." Molly stared. "A what?" "Merlin, Arthur," said Fred. George let the peas spill from his fingers. "A committee." "A subcommittee," said Percy, in the tone of someone correcting a sacred text. Arthur ignored him. "It's not formal yet. They're saying consultation, best practices, emergency communication, all that sort of thing." "Which means?" Molly asked. He looked at Ginny before answering, as if already regretting that the conversation could not be had elsewhere. But Ginny was there, and because she was there, everything now belonged partly to her whether adults wished it or not. "It means," Arthur said carefully, "that if Fudge gets enough pressure from the Prophet and enough worried letters from parents, he'll want ministry eyes on the school. Not to run it, he'll say, just to reassure." Ginny's spoon clicked against her bowl. No one had noticed she had stopped eating until then. Her face did not change much, but her knuckles whitened around the handle. Molly was at her side at once. "Ginny." "It's because of me," Ginny said. Not loudly. That made it worse. "No," Molly said with such force the kettle on the stove rattled. "It is because a wicked man put a wicked thing in your cauldron and then sat back to see what would happen." Arthur's eyes flickered toward the window where the garden shimmered in heat. "It's because people are frightened," he said. "And frightened people prefer locks to judgment." Percy, to his credit, seemed to hear the wrongness in that. He set down his parchment. "No one blames Ginny." Fred and George looked at him as one. "That's not the same," George said. Ginny pushed her chair back. "I'm not hungry." Molly reached for her, but Ginny had already slipped out through the back door and into the sunlight, crossing the yard with her head down. For a moment, the kitchen held only the sound of the clock ticking and the faint clatter of chickens investigating a bucket. Molly rounded on Arthur. "You said they wouldn't talk in front of her." "I said I'd try. She hears enough in this house to last a lifetime." Arthur took off his spectacles and polished them with the corner of his sleeve. A gesture Molly had learned meant he was buying himself seconds to answer. "She hears enough because it's happening." That silenced even Fred. After supper, when the heat had eased and long gold shadows lay across the orchard, Arthur found Ginny sitting on the low wall by the pumpkin patch, with her knees drawn up and a dead stalk between her hands. He sat beside her with the caution of a man approaching an injured creature that also happened to be his daughter. "Your mother wants to put anti-press wards around the whole property," he said. Ginny did not smile. Arthur looked out over the garden. Gnomes darted in the far beans. The twins were arguing near the shed. Somewhere above, one of the house's windows banged and corrected itself with a mutter. "Do you remember," he said, "when you were 6 and you hid under the stairs because you thought your owl had flown away forever?" Ginny sniffed. He had. He had flown into the pantry and refused to come out because Fred fed him pickled onion by mistake. She gave a watery, unwilling breath that was almost a laugh. Arthur went on, softer now. "You came out only when your mother said nobody was cross. Do you remember what you told her?" Ginny picked at the dead stalk. "No. You said you knew you had not done anything wrong, but you felt as though maybe you had become the sort of person wrong things happen through." At that, she turned and looked at him, startled. Arthur rested his forearms on his knees. "That's what shock does. It lies about shape. It tells you that because evil passed through your life, it must have left some of its outline behind." Ginny's mouth trembled. "What if people think I'm stupid?" "Some will," he said, honest enough to be trusted. "People are often stupid when it lets them feel safe. Let them. It says nothing about you." "Me." She leaned against him then, small again for the first time in weeks, and Arthur put an arm around her shoulders. The sun lowered. Moths began to stir in the hedge. From the kitchen came the muffled rise of Molly's voice scolding somebody for hexing peas into the teapot. "Dad," Ginny said after a while, "will they really put ministry people in the school?" Arthur was quiet so long that the answer was clear before he gave it. "They may try. Can Professor Dumbledore stop them?" "He can stop many things, but not all." Arthur turned his head and kissed the top of her hair. "No," he said. "Not all." A week later, the second blow fell. The news of Sirius Black's escape from Azkaban came not as rumor but as a full-throated scream from the front page. Grim-faced and black-bordered and impossible to mistake for anything but disaster. Molly sat down hard at the kitchen table when she saw it. Percy read every line aloud until Fred told him to stop sounding pleased with the punctuation. Arthur arrived home that evening later than ever, collar open, face drawn. "Fudge is in a state," he told Molly once the younger children had drifted upstairs and the twins were pretending not to listen from the landing. "Half the department's been turned inside out. He's terrified Black means to kill Harry Potter. Terrified of another public failure. And if one more editorial says Hogwarts isn't safe, he'll have reason and temper enough for both hands." Molly pressed her fingers to her forehead. "So now there are two fears to feed him." Arthur gave a humorless nod. Exactly. From the stairs, George said in a whisper to Fred, loud enough for everyone to hear. That's how you get a proper ministry monster. You feed it twice. No one laughed. In the silence that followed, Ginny's bedroom door closed very gently overhead. Harry did not learn the full shape of the summer's fear until the night bus deposited him beneath a washed gray London sky, and Cornelius Fudge himself met him at the leaky cauldron with a hand on his elbow and a smile so forced it barely qualified as kindness. There were other things Harry might have noticed first. The absence of outrage over Aunt Marge, the miraculous vanishing of any official desire to punish underage magic, the fact that a minister of magic standing in a Muggle street ought by rights to have been astonishing. But Fudge's face had the same strained, sleepless look Harry remembered from the hospital wing, and the shabby warmth of the pub did little to soften it. "My dear boy," Fudge said, steering him inside as though the paving stones themselves were unsafe. "What a relief. What a very great relief." Tom the barman made up a room at once. Suitcases appeared. Tea was ordered and ignored. Harry, exhausted and still full of the strange, reckless energy that came after catastrophe, sat in an armchair by the window, while Fudge paced the carpet and kept glancing at the door. "I won't be expelled?" Harry asked finally, because whatever else was happening, that question had lived in him since the moment Marge had struck the ceiling. "Expelled? No, certainly not." Fudge waved the idea away as though such matters were trivial. "These things happen, accidental magic in moments of emotional stress. Entirely understandable." Harry frowned. "Last time there was a house elf, I got a warning." Fudge made a sound that could have been a laugh if he had known how to enjoy one. "Circumstances, my dear boy. Circumstances. The ministry has rather more pressing concerns." She. His eyes slid toward the newspaper on the side table. Harry followed them. Sirius Black stared back in moving monochrome from the front page, gaunt and murderous and unmistakably real. The room seemed to cool by a degree. "Oh," Harry said. "Yes?" Fudge sank into the chair opposite and looked suddenly older. "Black escaped 3 days ago. First man ever to do it. There'll be patrols everywhere. Checks at the alley entrances. You're to stay here until school starts, do you understand? Here, where we know where you are." Harry, who had spent the last week wanting only to be somewhere the Dursleys could not reach, nodded at once. But the old anger stirred in him when Fudge added, almost absent-mindedly, "And Hogwarts will be taking extra precautions this year in any case. Temporary measures, naturally." "In any case?" Harry asked. "Because of Black? Because of Black? Because of last term? Because parents are nervous? Because newspapers exist?" Fudge rubbed at his whiskers. "You'd be surprised how quickly safety becomes a political word." Something in the way he said it made Harry remember the hospital wing, the lines around Arthur's eyes, the blank page and Ginny's white face. "What sort of precautions?" "Nothing that need trouble you." Which meant, Harry had already learned, that it certainly would. A bit more coordination, better reporting, perhaps a few ministry staff on hand to assist should anything unusual occur. Harry looked at him. "At Hogwarts?" Fudge seemed to hear the disbelief and become faintly defensive. "Not to interfere. To help. A school is not an island, Harry." Now until Hogwarts, Harry thought, had always felt a little like one. Not because it was cut off, but because everything inside it ran according to laws older and stranger than the world beyond. Staircases misbehaved. Ghosts carried grudges for centuries. Teachers could be terrifying and still belong to the place in a way the ministry never could. The idea of officials with parchment and worried expressions moving through those corridors felt wrong in a manner too deep to explain. Over the following days, Diagon Alley made that wrongness visible. There were ministry wizards at the archway from dawn to dusk, checking names with curt efficiency and glancing over shoulders, as though Black might materialize between the apothecary and flourish and blots. Wanted posters hung beside advertisements for self-inking quills. Owl shops did a brisk business in nervous correspondence. Parents buying cauldrons paused one another with the new intimacy of shared alarm. Harry heard the same phrases repeated in different voices as he wandered the cobbles alone in the mornings. After all that happened at the school, if even Azkaban can't hold him, the minister must do something. Dumbledore isn't enough anymore. Harry loathed those last words more each time he heard them. When Ron and Hermione arrived with the Weasleys, the alley seemed to brighten for a moment by sheer force of familiarity. Hermione embraced him so hard he nearly dropped his books. Ron grinned and complained at once about school robes, security queues, and Percy's desire to organize everyone into columns. Ginny stood a little behind them all, narrower than Harry remembered from June, and carrying herself with a self-conscious care that made his throat tighten. Molly wasted no time handing out parchment packets. "What's this?" Ron asked, peering at his. "Travel declarations," Molly said. "Platform checks. Emergency contact information. Identification charms. Don't roll your eyes at me, Ronald. I'm not the one making the rules." Fred, taking his packet, whistled low. "This is longer than my will." "That would imply you owned anything," said George. Arthur, who had just returned from speaking in low tones with a pair of ministry men near Quality Quidditch Supplies, came toward them with Harry's name already on his face. He drew Harry slightly aside, not so far that Molly could not still hear if she wished, but far enough to make the moment private. "Keep your head down this year," he said. Harry gave him a look that made Arthur sigh despite himself. "I know," he said. "That advice becomes less practical every time I offer it. But I mean it. Black is one thing. The mood around the school is another. Fudge thinks more eyes means more safety. Men like Malfoy are encouraging him. There'll be checks, patrols, reports. Anything unusual, and someone in green robes will want a copy." "No, not a big deal." Harry glanced toward the far end of the alley. Cornelius stood beneath the hanging sign of flourish and blots in conversation with Dumbledore. The contrast between them was so sharp it almost seemed staged. Fudge leaned in, all anxious insistence and ministerial fuss. Dumbledore listened with his hands folded behind his back, grave and still. Once, as Harry watched, Dumbledore looked past the minister and met Harry's eyes across the crowded street. The look held apology, warning, and some deeper patience Harry could not read. Then Lucius Malfoy stepped out from the shade of Madame Malkin's doorway and joined the conversation as if he had been summoned by the mere existence of influence. Draco came with him, pale and smooth and wearing boredom like an heirloom. Lucius bowed his head to the minister, exchanged a few words, and smiled in that bloodless way Harry had come to hate. "What's he doing here?" Harry muttered. "Exactly what he always does," Arthur said. "Standing near power until people forget it who invited him." The platform checks at King's Cross confirmed everything Arthur had implied. Ministry witches and wizards stood on the Muggle side in concealment charms, guiding anxious families through the barrier in staggered bursts. On the other side, a pair of uniformed officials with clipboards marked off names and asked whether anyone was carrying unusual objects, suspicious correspondence, or cursed artifacts. One even asked a harried mother if her child had lately reported hearing disembodied voices. The question struck Harry like a slap. He looked at Ginny. She had gone still, packet crushed in one hand. Hermione stepped between them before anyone else could notice. "Come on," she said briskly, gathering trunks with an efficiency almost violent in its tenderness. "If we leave Percy waiting much longer, he'll start assigning seats by blood type." On the platform itself, the Scarlet Engine breathed steam over clusters of students and worried parents. Percy strode up and down with his head boy badge shining, trying to appear indispensable and succeeding mostly in looking like a parade of one. Fred and George were already making bets on whether he would salute the engine. Molly kissed everyone twice. Arthur pulled Ginny aside for a private word and kissed her hair. Harry saw the shape of the moment even without hearing it. Courage offered in place of certainty. As the whistle blew, Dumbledore appeared near the front of the train, speaking with a grim-faced wizard from the Ministry and with Fudge, who had chosen in all the bustle to be visible. The minister's presence should have been reassuring. Instead, it made the departure feel supervised. Harry climbed aboard with Ron and Hermione, and as the train began to move, he looked back through the window. Molly was waving furiously. Percy was trying not to look moved. Arthur had one arm around Ginny's shoulders, and beyond them Cornelius Fudge stood under the drifting steam with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the carriages pull away as a man might watch the gate of a fortress he had not yet entered, but already meant to inspect. The journey north began in the ordinary way, and therefore felt like a reprieve. Chocolate frog cards flashed. Trunks thudded overhead. The corridor filled with the smells of pumpkin pasties, damp wool, and the sort of cheap perfume older girls put on in quantities better suited to fumigation. For a little while, Harry let the rhythm of the train persuade him that school, whatever anxieties surrounded it, was still school. Then he found the sleeping man in the compartment, and remembered that Hogwarts was always changing around him, shedding danger and growing new mysteries as trees shed leaves. Professor Lupin did not look like a professor. His robes were worn shiny at the cuffs, his face deeply lined for a man not yet old, and there was an exhaustion about him so complete that even the jolt of the train did not wake him. Ron whispered at once that he must be some kind of dangerous fugitive. Hermione pointed out in a deadly whisper that his case was stamped with the words Professor R.J. Lupin. Harry, looking at the hollows beneath the man's cheekbones and the careful patching at the elbow of his cloak, thought only that he had the appearance of somebody who had survived on less than was fair and learned to apologize for taking up room. Rain blurred the windows by mid-afternoon. The countryside darkened. The Sweets trolley came and went. Lupin slept on, hands folded loosely over a threadbare satchel, as though trust were either an old habit or a luxury he could not afford to examine. The train slowed with a squeal of brakes that set everyone glancing up. Voices rose in the corridor. The lights flickered and went out. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then cold entered. It did not come as a draft, but as a possession of the air itself, a draining away of warmth so absolute it seemed to pull memory with it. Harry heard the compartment door slide open, heard Ron suck in breath through his teeth, heard Hermione whisper, "What is that?" The creature that bent its hooded shape through the doorway was less like a person than a ruin of one. Rotting hands, a face hidden where no face ought to be hidden. A darkness gathered under cloth. It searched the compartment by means Harry could not understand, and in that searching Harry felt the world split open somewhere very far away. A woman screamed. A burst of green light. A laugh that was not laughter. His mother's voice. Then, nothing. When he came back, it was to the taste of chocolate and the sensation of everybody trying not to stare while plainly staring very hard. The train had resumed its motion. Rain tapped the glass with obscene normalcy. Lupin was kneeling by him with a square of chocolate in one hand and his wand still out in the other. "He ate," he said. Harry obeyed because the command contained no room for pride. The chocolate melted on his tongue like heat remembered rather than heat itself. Across from him, Ron looked as though he had been emptied out. Hermione had gone white to the lips. Even Ginny, who had been in the next compartment and had come in at some point after the commotion, stood rigid by the door with her arms wrapped around herself. "What was it?" Harry asked, though he knew in his bones that no answer would make the thing less terrible. "A Dementor," Lupin said. "One of Azkaban's guards." Ron found his voice before his color. "What's one of those doing on the train?" "Searching," said Lupin. For whom? None of them needed told. The search did not end with the Dementor's departure. When the train rolled at last into Hogsmeade Station beneath a sky, the color of old tin, ministry lanterns were already moving along the platform like captive stars. Students descended under scrutiny. Trunks were stacked and checked. Names were called. An official with a clipboard and a pinched expression asked compartment by compartment whether anyone had seen anything suspicious, heard anything unusual, concealed anything they ought not. Harry, still feeling as though some essential layer of himself had been peeled back and exposed to weather, answered in monosyllables. A second official, This one, young, eager, and smelling strongly of ink, approached Lupin, who stood with his shabby case in one hand and a look of thinning patience on his face. "Professor," the wizard said, "the minister's office would appreciate a brief account of the magical response performed during the incident. Merely procedural." Lupin regarded him with quiet dislike. "The magical response," he said, "consisted of preventing school children from having their souls sucked out on public transport." "Yes, but for the record." "For the record," Lupin replied. "I suggest writing that exactly." Hermione made a noise that might have become a laugh in any other year. The official retreated, flustered. Harry looked at Lupin with new gratitude. Not because the professor had rescued him, though that mattered. Not even because he had mocked a ministry clerk with perfect calm. It was because, in the chaos after the Dementor, Lupin had behaved as though the students were persons before they were liabilities. Harry was beginning to understand how rare that would become. Outside the station, the usual confusion of first years, lanterns and giant figures calling, "Furs years over here," was altered by the presence of more adults than the knights seemed to need. Hagrid loomed as he always did, enormous and comforting, beard wet with drizzle and voice booming. But beyond him stood more ministry men than Harry had ever seen near Hogwarts, some in dark traveling cloaks, some in green. They watched the students board the carriages and, from time to time, checked lists by lantern light. "Why are they searching our trunks?" Ron demanded as one wizard passed a detection charm over a pile of luggage. "What do they think we've got in there?" Fred, hefting his own trunk toward a carriage, said, "Given this family, that's a dangerous question." George nodded toward the officials. "Best not tell them about your socks. They'll confiscate those on moral grounds." Ginny managed a small smile at that, then lost it when a gust of cold hit from the far end of the platform where the Dementors stood beyond the lamps. Harry saw the moment she felt them. Her pupils widened, her hand tightened convulsively on the carriage door. He reached out without thinking and steadied it for her. She looked at him in surprise, then climbed in. The thestral-drawn carriages lurched into motion through the wet dark. Hogwarts rose ahead by degrees, lit windows surfacing from shadow, towers gathering shape above the trees. Usually the sight made something ease in Harry at once. "Home," said the castle every year, whether anyone had used the word aloud or not. Tonight the relief came tangled with another feeling, thin and sharp. The lights at the gate were brighter than he remembered. Figures moved there, who did not belong to the school. Filch stood beside them with a self-satisfied stiffness so pure it ought to have been bottled. As the carriages drew up, students were directed not immediately to the doors, but through two parallel lines. One for first years, one for everyone else. Prefects checked names. A witch with a wand and a lacquered clipboard asked for platform declarations. Percy positively glowed with purpose. "This is absurd," Ron muttered as they shuffled forward. "It's temporary," Hermione said automatically, then bit her lip as if hearing how much the phrase now sounded like a slogan. When Harry's turn came, the witch glanced at his name, glanced at his face, and altered visibly. "Mr. Potter, you experienced unusual effects during the train search." Harry stared at her. "I fainted." She wrote something. "Have you previously reported sensitivities to creatures of the non-being class?" "No." Another note. "If further episodes occur, the Ministry requests immediate documentation." Before Harry could answer, Dumbledore's voice sounded from the top of the steps, mild and carrying. "Mr. Potter will report any concerns to his head of house, as Hogwarts students have done for some centuries." "Thank you." "Aye." The witch looked up, colored, and moved aside. Dumbledore stood beneath the carved lintel of the great doors with the torchlight behind him, his expression perfectly courteous. Only the set of his shoulders gave away that courtesy was being used here as a shield rather than a welcome. Inside, the entrance hall rang with wet footsteps and voices, but even that familiar clamor had changed. A pair of ministry wizards stood near the hourglasses. Another conferred quietly with McGonagall at the foot of the marble stairs. The school was full, all at once. of people who held themselves like temporary furniture and expected to be thanked for not leaving marks on the floor. Harry followed the crowd toward the great hall and thought, with a sick certainty that had nothing to do with Dementors, that the year had not merely begun under threat. It had begun under supervision. The sorting finished to thinner applause than usual. Even the new first years seemed to sense that whatever magic usually wrapped the opening feast in wonder had been frayed before they arrived. Candles floated overhead by the hundreds, reflected in the gold plates and goblets below, and the enchanted ceiling wore a sweep of clouds so dark it seemed the weather had followed them indoors. Yet the true heaviness in the hall came not from storm but from expectation. There was an extra chair at the staff table. It had been placed between Dumbledore and Professor Snape, with the kind of careful neutrality institutions reserved for offensive symbols. Cornelius Fudge occupied it with his robes arranged to suggest informality, and achieved instead the look of a man sitting inside a compromise. Several teachers watched him with expressions that ranged from icy tolerance to outright distaste. Snape, inscrutable as ever, let one long hand rest against his goblet, and did not seem to consider the minister important enough to notice. McGonagall's posture could have cut glass. Hagrid, at the far end, looked as though he had come prepared for either a feast or a hanging, and was not sure which would be served first. When the last first year reached the bench assigned by the hat, Dumbledore rose. "Welcome," he said, and the words still carried warmth enough to alter the room. "To those of you returning, welcome home. To our new students, welcome to Hogwarts. Before we begin our meal, there are a few matters of safety to address." Safety. Harry felt the hall react to it as one body might react to the touch of a cold hand. Dumbledore went on, voice level and unhurried. "As you know, Sirius Black has escaped from Azkaban. Dementors from the Ministry have been stationed at the school boundaries in hopes of preventing his entry. I remind you that no student is to approach them for any reason." A murmur rippled along the benches. Harry saw several first years glance fearfully toward the walls, as though the creatures might already be waiting behind the tapestries. "In addition," Dumbledore said, and now the words seemed to cost him more, "the Ministry of Magic and the Hogwarts Board of Governors have agreed upon certain temporary procedures for the duration of the current situation." Temporary procedures. There it was again, mild as broth and twice as difficult to stomach. Fudge stood. He did not clear his throat at once. He gave the room time to recognize him, perhaps believing that recognition would be reassuring. What Harry saw instead was a hall full of children, discovering that the man responsible for wizarding Britain looked smaller under Hogwarts' ceiling than he did in the Prophet. "My dear young witches and wizards," Fudge began, with the practiced benevolence of someone who liked audiences better than individuals, "let me say first what a privilege it is to address you in this most storied institution." Fred made a barely audible gagging noise. George kicked him under the bench with brotherly precision. "No one," Fudge continued, "wishes to burden student life unnecessarily. The measures being introduced are prudent, limited, and designed solely for your protection. In extraordinary times, cooperation is the surest path to confidence." "Noi, andiamo." Harry looked down the Gryffindor table. Confidence was not the expression he saw. Fudge unrolled a parchment sealed in green. "Effective immediately. All student parcels and incoming post may be screened for cursed or dangerous objects. Certain corridors will be closed after curfew except by staff permission. Prefects will assist in reporting irregularities. Students are reminded to notify a teacher or designated official if they observe suspicious behavior. Unauthorized persons, unexplained messages, or unusual magical objects. If any student experiences recurrent disturbing voices, lapses of memory, or missing periods of time, these are to be reported without delay." "None." The sentence struck the hall like a bell. Harry turned so fast his bench scraped stone. Ginny sat 3 places down, motionless, one hand flat on the table beside her untouched goblet. The noise around her had become remote. He could see it in the set of her mouth, the way the blood had suddenly drained from her face. Around her, others were merely listening. She was hearing accusation. Ron followed Harry's gaze. and went rigid. Hermione's expression sharpened with immediate understanding and anger. Percy, at the other end of the table in his place as head boy, was still looking earnestly toward the dais, not yet aware of the wound the minister had just opened in the room behind him. Fudge read on. Random verification checks may be conducted in common areas where credible concerns arise. Student movement after hours will be more closely monitored. These provisions are temporary and will be reviewed as circumstances allow. None. He smiled then, expecting perhaps relief. The smile died quickly. When Dumbledore resumed standing, it was clear to Harry that the headmaster had allowed the minister his speech only because the alternative had been a struggle played out over the heads of children. "Thank you, Cornelius," he said. "I trust we may now attend to supper, which remains one of the better safeguards against despair." A ripple of laughter, thin but real, passed through the hall. It did not mend the thing that had happened, but it reminded Harry that Dumbledore still knew how to pull a room back from the brink. Food appeared in gleaming abundance. Platters steamed. Gravy shone. Pumpkin juice sloshed into goblets. The familiar miracle of it might have comforted Harry if he had not felt beside him the particular stillness of somebody holding herself together by threads. Ginny did not touch a thing. Halfway through the meal, before the puddings arrived, she rose without a word and slipped from the bench. Percy called her name too softly to be in order. Molly was not there to notice. The teachers were occupied by the political theater of not looking at the minister too long. Harry stood before he had decided to and ignored Ron's muttered, "Go on." He found her in the side corridor between the great hall and the entrance hall, pressed against the wall beneath a suit of armor whose visors stared blankly over her head. The torches threw gold on her hair and left the rest of her pale. "I'm fine," she said at once, which was how Harry knew she was not. He stopped a few feet away. "You don't have to be." That seemed to anger her more than reassurance would have. He said it as if... She broke off, swallowed, and looked down at her hands. As if all of that was just another symptom on a form. Harry leaned back against the opposite wall. Beyond the open door, he could hear the rise and fall of feast noise, strangely distant. "He doesn't know." "No," Ginny said. "He doesn't." And there it was, the hard little island in the middle of the conversation. She did not mean only that Fudge did not know what possession felt like. She meant that he did not know what it meant for a room full of children to hear a thing named and not named at once, to feel the eyes of strangers shifting, as if some hidden category had just been announced. "He's afraid," Harry said. She laughed once, without mirth. "That helps." Harry thought of the diary, of words appearing in ink where no hand had been, of the way Riddle had looked at him from another boy's face with absolute certainty that no adult system would recognize him. "No," Harry admitted. "It doesn't." Ginny's eyes shone, but she did not cry. "They'll all wonder now. Maybe. That's supposed to make me feel better?" "No." He pushed off the wall and came a little closer, choosing honesty because anything else sounded too much like a ministry speech. "I think some of them will wonder. I think some will be stupid. I think some won't understand anything unless it happens to them. But it still wasn't your fault." Her jaw trembled. "I know that in my head." "I know." Harry looked past her at the stone floor. "That's the worst part, isn't it? Knowing something and not being able to make the rest of you catch up." "No." For the first time since he had come out to the corridor, she really looked at him. There was surprise in it, and gratitude, and something sadder. The recognition of shared damage. Harry felt it too. The basilisk had not been the only thing in the chamber. There had been a kind of knowledge there, bright and poisonous, that institutions failed, that adults could miss obvious evil if it arrived politely, that children might be asked afterward to perform recovery in public. Ginny wiped angrily at one eye. "Percy's going to start handing out suspicious object forms at breakfast. He'd laminate them if he could." A genuine laugh escaped her then, brief and unwilling and precious. Harry smiled despite himself. From the hall came the thunder of pudding appearing and the twins' instantly audible approval. Ginny drew a breath, let it out, and straightened. "Come on. she said. "If I don't go back, Fred will say the minister's speech killed me." Harry fell into step beside her. As they reached the door, they both paused. Fudge was still at the staff table, conversing in low, earnest tones with Dumbledore, as though reason and administration had simply met in civilized discussion. A stack of green-sealed parchments sat at his elbow. Percy was already conferring with McGonagall about prefect rosters. Along the side wall, unnoticed by most students, a ministry wizard was fastening a small brass plaque near the entrance, a set of emergency reporting instructions for unusual magical disturbances. The plaque caught the candlelight and flashed. Harry had the strange, unpleasant thought that if one kept hanging enough instructions around a place, eventually the walls themselves might begin to sound official. The first weeks of term altered Hogwarts by degrees subtle enough that a visitor might have missed them, and the students could not. It began with the doors. More were locked after dark. Those that remained open often wore notices. Temporary restrictions, designated passages, authorized movement only after curfew. A brass stand appeared by the entrance hall with a ledger for late returns, and beside it a second, narrower stand where incoming parcels could be left for screening. Owls took offense. Hedwig in particular developed a habit of nipping the gloves of any official who presumed to handle her with insufficient reverence. Then came the rhythms. Prefects made rounds with increased solemnity. Filch flourished lists as though he had at last been given a holy text. Students who had once wandered by instinct now found themselves pausing at checkpoints so minor they could scarcely be called that, and yet accumulated, one after another, until the whole castle felt fractionally slower. The school was not transformed into a prison. That would have been too obvious, too vulgar, and would have provoked resistance at once. It was made merely more managed, which was harder to fight because each piece of it could be defended as sensible. Hermione tried at first to be sensible. "Well," she said on the third morning as they queued at breakfast behind a Ravenclaw whose package of chocolate from home was being prodded with a detection charm, "screening post after what happened last year isn't entirely absurd." "No," said Ron. "It's just insulting. It's precaution. It's punishment with good handwriting." Harry said nothing. He was watching the clerk at the parcels table. The witch had a patient expression and a silver stamp she pressed to each cleared item. Ministry check. The stamp looked harmless. Yet there was something in the neatness of it that made his skin crawl. The diary had not looked dangerous either. By the second week, even Hermione's patience began to fray. Professor Lupin's classes, which quickly became the high point of third year, were observed twice by ministry staff, under the pretense of reviewing practical safety standards. One clerk spent an entire Boggart lesson taking notes about student distress responses and the appropriateness of humor as a defensive tactic. When Lupin transformed Professor Snape's looming menace into a grandmother's dress and the class dissolved into helpless laughter, the clerk wrote with disapproval so earnest it became comic. Afterward, Hermione said, "He was going to note that laughter reduced fear, and then he decided that meant the method lacked rigor." Ron snorted. "Maybe next lesson we can all cry for standards." Harry, carrying his books and still warm with the astonishing sensation of having watched fear become ridiculous, saw Lupin speaking quietly with Dumbledore at the end of the corridor. The professor's lined face wore the expression of a man too weary to be surprised, but still too honorable not to mind. That was the other thing the new rules did. They made the adults reveal themselves by how they bent under scrutiny. McGonagall became sharper, not less kind but more exact. Her classroom tolerated less nonsense than ever, perhaps because nonsense was one of the few things she still controlled. Snape moved through the altered atmosphere like a fish returned to water, dryly obedient where he must be, and privately gleeful whenever a regulation inconvenienced someone he disliked. Hagrid, taking up his new post as care of magical creatures professor with a pride so vulnerable it hurt to witness, reacted to the presence of officials by becoming alternately over-explanatory and aggressively casual. Every time a ministry note-taker attended his lesson, the creatures bit twice as often. Percy flourished. That was unfair to him, Harry knew. Percy did not want oppression. Percy wanted order, approval, and a world in which every list proved useful, because every list had been made by somebody who knew better. He took the new responsibilities with terrible sincerity. He checked corridor rosters, enforced curfew times, and once attempted to institute a sign-out slip for after-dinner library visits, before Madame Pince drove him bodily from the room, with a feather duster and a curse in a language Harry did not recognize. Ginny changed more quietly. She was still laughed over by Fred and George, still fussed over by Molly's letters, still often overshadowed by the larger red-haired weather systems around her. But there were days when Harry would catch sight of her across the courtyard or in the library and see the effort of normalcy as plainly as if it had been embroidered on her robes. She hated being asked if she was all right. She hated more being not asked. Once, in Charms, a Hufflepuff girl dropped a blank notebook and Ginny flinched so hard her desk rattled. After class, Harry found her in the alcove outside the portrait of Wendelin the Weird. "You can tell me to go away," he said. Ginny leaned her head against the stone. "I considered it." "Excellent. Means you're recovering." "No." She gave him a sideways look. "You're getting cheeky. Ron says it's contagious." For a moment, she only breathed. The castle around them lived its ordinary life. Staircases shifting, portraits gossiping, distant shouts from somewhere a floor up. Yet under it all was the new thread, the awareness that at any time a question might come from the wrong quarter and require an answer it had not earned. "I keep thinking," she said at last, "that if they ask enough questions, they'll somehow find a piece of him that's still there." Harry understood at once whom she meant. He also understood that no answer he gave could be enough. "Do you think there is?" "No." She drew the word out until it sounded like an argument with herself. "Not really. But then I remember how little I knew while it was happening." He looked through the arrow-slit window at the grounds below, where a pair of dark figures moved near the gate, and the Dementors beyond them stood like rents in the daylight. "They don't know how to ask the right things anyway," he said. "That's true," Ginny said, and smiled a little. Quidditch suffered too. Not fatally. Nothing at Hogwarts that inspired too much shouting ever suffered fatally. But the pitch now required scheduling confirmations, weather checks, and acknowledgement that at any moment a Dementor presence on the grounds might result in suspension of practice. Oliver Wood took this as a personal insult from the state. He began carrying copies of the pitch booking ledger under his arm with the air of a revolutionary preserving contraband. "Have you ever seen anyone murder parchment with a glare?" Hermione asked as Oliver stalked away from a dispute with the ministry steward over broom access. "Give him a minute," said Ron. "He'll innovate." To Harry, whose broom had always meant more than sport, freedom, height, control, the idea that practice could be interrupted because a clerk had concerns made his teeth hurt. Flying above the school, he could almost forget the watching. Down on the grass, he had to sign his name and promise obedience before he could mount. The letters from home grew more detailed. Molly wanted to know whether the screens were respectful. Arthur wanted to know whether the extra presents seemed coordinated through the board or directly through the minister's office. Fred and George wrote from across the common room when they were too lazy to speak, sending folded paper airplanes full of reports about Percy's latest attempt to civilize disorder. Harry answered all of them, though sometimes he found himself leaving out the very thing he most wanted to say. How do you explain that a place has become less itself without being able to point to the exact stone that changed? The best answer he found came from a portrait. It was a mild evening. Harry, Ron, and Hermione were crossing the third-floor corridor after supper when a ministry wizard stationed near the side passage stopped a cluster of second years and began asking where they were headed, why they had chosen that route, and whether they had seen anyone unknown near the east stair. The children answered with widening eyes. When the official had finally waved them on, one of the older portraits on the wall, a witch in heavy Tudor sleeves who had seen at least 3 centuries of students and despised all of them equally, said in a carrying whisper, "That's not a school. That's a queue with towers." Ron barked a laugh. Hermione looked scandalized and pleased. Harry, before he could help it, smiled with something like relief. Because there it was. Not the whole truth, but a piece of it. By October, the phrase temporary procedures had become so common that students used it ironically whenever anything unpleasant occurred. Bad weather at breakfast? Temporary procedures. Homework from Snape? Temporary procedures. Peeves dropping water balloons on passing officials, and then singing a rude ballad about inspections. Enthusiastic temporary procedures. Humor kept the thing from solidifying too quickly. But humor did not dissolve it. One evening, coming back from the library, Harry noticed that two of the side doors leading toward lesser-used stairwells had acquired fresh seals. Green wax. Ministry marks. A small thing. He stood looking at them for longer than made sense. Hermione, following his gaze, said quietly, "They do it because every time people get used to one change, the next one looks smaller." Harry turned. "How do you know that?" She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, eyes on the sealed door. "Because history isn't only goblin rebellions and treaties. Sometimes it's corridors getting narrower until nobody remembers they were wider." Now, Ron looked between them, frowned at the door, and said with great feeling, "I hate when you say clever things that make everything worse." Somewhere down the hall, Peeves cackled. A ministry clerk hurried past carrying a stack of forms. Above them, the torches spat softly in their brackets. The castle endured, as old places do, but Harry was beginning to suspect endurance and freedom were not the same thing. Halloween arrived with pumpkins the size of armchairs, drifting candlelight, and the sort of determined merriment schools produce when they suspect celebration is itself a form of defiance. For a few hours, Hogwarts almost managed to feel like itself again. The great hall blazed gold. Hagrid's decorations swung grotesquely from the rafters. Nearly headless Nick glided in unusual cheer among the Gryffindor table. Even the first years, who had spent 2 months learning to lower their voices around official shoes, screamed with delighted disgust when the feast revealed trays of sweets shaped like severed fingers. Harry ate too much, laughed at one of the twins' muttered impressions of Fudge, and for a moment let his guard down. Then the message went around the hall in a ripple of confusion. Everyone to the common rooms by a different route. A disturbance on the 7th floor. Prefects to front and rear. McGonagall rose so quickly her chair toppled backward. Dumbledore was already moving before anyone asked why. The corridor outside Gryffindor Tower answered them. The fat lady's portrait hung in ribbons. The canvas had been slashed from throat to hem by some violence so sudden and furious that bits of paint still curled inward from the cuts. The frame leaned crooked. Students crowded the passage in frightened knots while Percy, white to the lips, tried to impose order on something beyond his training. Sir Cadogan shouted from a nearby picture that he had offered battle and been disgracefully refused. The neighboring portraits gabbled over one another in scandal. "Sirius Black," somebody whispered. The name spread faster than any spell. Harry stared at the shredded canvas and felt the school tilt inside him. Black had not merely approached Hogwarts. He had entered it, crossed it, climbed it, and struck at the very doorway to Gryffindor while all the precautions, all the reports, all the men with their lists and lanterns and assurances had gone on below, like a play performed for the wrong audience. The children were marched, under protest and under watch, to the great hall to sleep there while the castle was searched. Benches were shoved aside. Bedding appeared. Students huddled in house groups beneath the bewitched ceiling, now black and starless. Teachers moved quickly among them. The atmosphere was no longer festive but military. Instructions passed in clipped tones. Heads counted, torches flaring, doors watched. Fudge arrived within half an hour. Harry did not see from where. One moment the hall door stood open onto corridors of running footsteps, and the next, the minister was striding in, cloak thrown over night robes, cheeks blotched with haste. Behind him came 2 officials from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, then Lucius Malfoy in winter dark velvet, as though he had dressed for a funeral he hoped to enjoy. The sight of him there, polished and composed amid frightened children, made something ugly and helpless surge in Harry. Dumbledore met them halfway down the aisle between the rolled-out bedding. His face was calm in the particular way lightning is calm before it chooses a tree. He was inside the school, Fudge said without preamble. Yes. Under every protective measure presently in place. Yes. Fudge's voice climbed. Then, plainly, those measures are insufficient. Around them, students pretended not to listen and failed utterly. Teachers edged nearer without seeming to do so. Lucius stood just behind the minister's shoulder, silent for the moment, allowing panic to make his case. Dumbledore said, "Or plainly, the man we seek knows this castle in ways no standing order can untangle." "That is not an answer I can offer, parents." "No," Dumbledore said. "It is only the truth." Lucius entered then, soft as a blade entering cloth. Truth has its uses, but families generally prefer protection. McGonagall appeared at Dumbledore's side with a tartan dressing gown over her robes and murder in her eyes. "Protection was not improved, Mr. Malfoy, by the presence of bureaucrats at our doors." Lucius inclined his head. "On the contrary, Professor, tonight makes the need for stronger intervention unanswerable." "Intervention," repeated McGonagall. "You mean intrusion?" Fudge looked between them, flushed and breathing too fast. The hall, the children on blankets, the shredded portrait, the knowledge that Sirius Black had breached the school. Everything pressed on him at once. Harry could see him losing the space in which he usually arranged his words into caution. What came out instead was bare. "I will not be the minister who leaves this place to chance," he said. Dumbledore's gaze sharpened. "Then do not leave it to fear." But the moment had already gone. Fudge turned to his officials. "Full search. Common rooms, service passages, upper floors, outbuildings. Coordinate with prefects and staff. Any portrait witness is to be interviewed at once, and I want written recommendations by morning for expanded internal security authority." "There it is," Fred muttered from his blanket. George, beside him, answered under his breath. "Took him long enough." Harry, who had been moved with the rest of Gryffindor toward the center of the hall, found sleep impossible. Long after whispered conversations had thinned to nervous muttering and then to wakeful silence, he slipped from his blankets with the invisibility cloak under one arm. Ron stirred but did not stop him. Hermione opened one eye, took in the cloak, and mouthed, "Don't be an idiot." Harry gave her the sort of apologetic look that always meant he was about to be exactly that. The corridors outside the hall had become a moving grid of lantern light. Ministry men and teachers crossed and recrossed. Armor was questioned. Tapestries lifted. Portraits shook themselves awake and provided contradictory testimony. Harry kept close to the walls, following voices until he found the one he wanted. Dumbledore's, low and dangerous, coming from a classroom near the staircase to the headmaster's office. Through the cracked door he saw them. Fudge stood at a desk littered with maps of the castle. Lucius leaned one shoulder against the mantel, elegant as poison. McGonagall was there, along with Snape and two governors Harry did not know who must have been summoned by flu. Dumbledore stood apart from the group, hands folded, the only man in the room who looked as though the walls belonged more to him than the meeting did. "This cannot continue as a private kingdom," Lucius was saying. "A fugitive has entered the school despite your wards, despite your staff, despite the minister's earlier accommodations. If ever there were grounds for formal ministry authority within Hogwarts, they are now." "Hogwarts," said Dumbledore, "is not failing because it lacks stamps." Snape's lip twitched very slightly. Fudge slapped a hand against the desk. "Albus, enough." Tonight, a mass murderer reached the door of a student dormitory. "Nah." "And tonight," Dumbledore replied, "a hall full of frightened children listens while adults decide whether fear shall become policy." One of the governors, a broad-shouldered witch in silver spectacles, said, "It already has." The words settled like frost. Fudge ran both hands over his face. "Then let us at least have the honesty to do it thoroughly. I want authority for internal patrols where needed, immediate inspection of student effects in any house where a breach may have occurred, direct reporting from prefects to ministry liaison officers, and temporary review of staff security compliance." Now, McGonagall actually took a step forward. You will not turn children's dormitories into search sites because your pride is injured. My pride? Fudge snapped. My students, she returned. Lucius looked from one to the other with serene interest. Temporary extraordinary powers, Professor Dardar. Surely you do not object to temporary powers during extraordinary danger. Nah. Harry had heard enough temporary to last a lifetime. Dumbledore's voice, when it came, was quiet. I object, he said, to the habit of building permanence out of frightened knights. Fudge met his eyes. Harry expected, wanted, the headmaster to refuse outright, to split the meeting with a word and send the ministry back to its gates. But Dumbledore looked beyond Fudge then, perhaps to the great hall full of children, perhaps to the parents who would read tomorrow's prophet, perhaps to all the ways schools could be closed by men who called closure responsibility. When he spoke at last, the concession in the words was narrow enough to wound. You will not have free movement through this school, he said. But there will be searched areas before dawn, under faculty supervision only. No child will be questioned alone. No Dementor crosses the threshold. Fudge seized on the first part of the answer and ignored the rest. Good. Good. Sensible. Lucius smiled. Harry drew back from the door feeling sick, not with surprise, but with a more adult horror. Dumbledore had not been defeated in some grand, visible way. He had been cornered into choosing the lesser injury. That was how institutions yielded. Not all at once, but under the weight of protecting what remained. Below, in the great hall, students turned in their blankets and waited for the morning that would tell them what had changed while they were trying not to be afraid. Morning did not improve matters. It merely gave them paperwork. Students were woken before dawn by the movement of adults and the hard brightness of charmed lamps. The great hall looked as though a campaign had bivouacked there. Rumpled blankets, abandoned shoes, half-awake children sitting upright with hair wild around frightened faces. Teachers moved along the rows, counting, soothing, instructing. At the doors, ministry officials checked names against lists and passed sealed memoranda from hand to hand with the solemnity of priests exchanging relics. Harry had slept perhaps an hour. He sat up to find Ginny already awake 2 blankets over, staring at nothing. Fred and George were whispering furiously by the foot of their bedding. Percy, who had spent much of the night attempting to be simultaneously comforting and authoritative, now looked as though he had been aged by 6 years and promoted by 3. What's happening? Somebody called from the Hufflepuff cluster. McGonagall answered from the center aisle, voice clipped, but not unkind. Certain areas of the school are being searched. Breakfast will be served here. No one is to return to common rooms until your head of house has given permission. Naiga, Agassi. Dira, there is sure. A Ravenclaw asked whether Sirius Black had been caught. Nobody answered at once, which was answer enough. The searches began with the practical locations, towers, storage rooms, unused classrooms, service passages where dust lay thick enough to record recent movement. But practical quickly proved elastic. Gryffindor's dormitory was inspected by McGonagall and a ministry wizard under her eye. Slytherin's by Snape and another official who looked far less confident once faced with the dungeons. Ravenclaw's prefects were required to produce access records for their tower. Hufflepuff's barrels were tapped, checked and retapped until one of the portraits suggested the ministry was likely to drown before breakfast if it continued being so suspicious near kitchens. When McGonagall came to fetch Gryffindor back upstairs, she did so with the expression of a general returning from an offensive she had half prevented. The common room looked untouched and violated at once. Trunks had been moved and replaced. Curtains were tied back. A set of school robes lay folded incorrectly on Dean Thomas's bed, proof that some official had handled them and possessed no basic upbringing. The fire burned as always, but the room no longer felt sealed from the world beyond its portrait hole. Ron stopped in the doorway and said, with all the weight of prophecy, "I hate them." Hermione did not correct his pronoun. Percy, already halfway to turning the event into a lesson on orderly procedure, began, The circumstances are exceptional. Fred turned on him. Did they search your bed, Percy? Percy drew himself up. Yes, George said. Did you enjoy it? Don't be absurd. Then why are you speaking as if everybody ought to write the minister a thank you note? Percy flushed darkly. Because Black was in the castle, and now the ministry is in our socks, Fred said. Different intruder, same discomfort. Harry might have laughed if he had not seen Ginny sink slowly into one of the armchairs by the fire and sit with her hands locked together so tightly her fingers had gone white. He crossed the room and crouched beside her. You all right? No, she said, not even pretending. There was a woman in the dormitory asking if anyone had ever found unusual objects in my things. His stomach turned. Who asked? Some official with a sharp nose and a notebook. Ginny stared into the fire. Professor McGonagall sent her away, but not before she asked whether I kept journals. Harry shut his eyes briefly. He could picture it too easily. The earnest intrusion, the tone of administrative concern, the blindness of people who believe the right to question came bundled with a badge. What did you say? That I don't owe her an inventory of my drawers? A tremor passed through her then, halfway to a laugh and halfway to tears. It sounded braver at the time. It was brave. Ginny's shoulders rose. I didn't feel brave. I felt like if she found an old scrap of parchment with my handwriting on it. Harry sat back on his heels and looked around the common room. The boys were grumbling over displaced belongings. Hermione was speaking in rapid undertones to Parvati and Lavender about whether ministry officials possessed the right to conduct such searches without explicit board authorization. Neville was trying to find Trevor amid the commotion. Everything ordinary had resumed at the edges, and in the center of it sat the knowledge that privacy, once broken, was difficult to reassemble. Downstairs the portrait hole opened, and Fred and George slipped in, carrying toast filched from breakfast and expressions uncommonly sober for them. Word from the battlefield, Fred announced, tossing Ron a slice. George leaned against the mantel. They're posting internal patrol times on the second-floor notice board. Temporary, naturally. Temporary enough to have timetables, said Hermione darkly. Fred jerked his chin toward Harry and Ginny. Also heard a ministry bloke asking Filch whether students ever use concealed architectural alternatives. Ron blinked. What's that? Passages, George said. Stairs. Holes. Bits of castle that don't like being catalogued. Harry looked up sharply. Did Filch tell him anything? Fred grinned without humor. Filch knows less about the place than he thinks he does. Tragic, really. George tossed a crust at the fire. Point is, they can search till Christmas and still miss half the ways a determined person can move about. Hermione's eyes narrowed. How do you know that? The twins looked at one another with synchronized innocence so false it might have been choreographed. Instinct, Fred said. Scholarship, said George. Percy made a sound of despair and buried his face in his hands. That afternoon, Fudge established a temporary operations room in an unused classroom near the entrance hall. The phrase appeared on a notice outside the door and was enough, by itself, to make Harry's jaw clench. Temporary operations room. It sounded like the castle had sprouted an annex for war, and everyone was expected to be grateful for the efficiency. Students passed the room in wary silence. Through the open door, Harry sometimes saw maps pinned to boards, corridor reports, stacks of statements from portraits, lists of staff and prefect duties, and Cornelius bent over them with a concentration more frantic than capable. He was not happy there. That was the strangest thing. Power had expanded around him, and he looked none the better for it. He looked haggard, cornered by the very machinery he had chosen to set in motion. Once Harry, on his way back from potions, stopped just within hearing distance of the open door. I am telling you, Fudge snapped to one of his clerks. I need every unidentified access point accounted for. Sir, with respect, the castle appears to resent cartographic assumptions. That is not a sentence I can file. It is nevertheless accurate. Harry moved on before he smiled. But small satisfactions could not undo the larger truth. Internal patrol rosters were indeed posted. Additional prefect reporting forms appeared. 2 ministry stewards began taking evening positions near the main staircases under the guise of assisting with curfew compliance. Their presence was not brutal. It was worse, in a way, because it was mundane. They stood, they watched, they made notes. Children altered their routes around them without being told. That night, as Harry lay awake in his 4-poster listening to the fire settle and the castle murmur in its sleep, he realized something that made his heart beat faster with a different sort of fear. The ministry did not need to own a place in order to change it. It needed only to remain long enough that everyone else started behaving as though its staying were inevitable. The decree arrived with the season's first hard frost. By then, the panic after Black's intrusion had settled into something colder and more durable. Sir Cadogan had been installed in place of the Fat Lady and was already proving so belligerently hospitable that students missed her more with every passing day. The ministry's operations room, intended for immediate crisis management, had developed shelves. A second notice board had appeared outside it, listing revised internal safety guidance. Fudge himself no longer slept at the castle, but he came and went often enough that his presence had become a feature of the week rather than an event. Each visit left behind fresh instructions, more coordination, one more incremental concession called temporary, until the word itself wore thin as old cloth. One iron morning, Harry saw the owl before breakfast. It came over the black line of the Forbidden Forest with a flight too direct to belong to ordinary correspondence, dropped like a stone into the headmaster's tower, and left behind on the sill a thick document folded around more seals than seemed decent. From the courtyard below, where students crossed in breath clouds between castle and greenhouses, the parchment gleamed green and gold in the pale sun. McGonagall was summoned within minutes. So was Fudge. Harry knew because news moved now through Hogwarts in the altered pattern of watched places. Prefects heard first. Portraits heard second. Students assembled the rest from glances, absences, and the simple arithmetic of who climbed which staircase in a hurry. By breakfast, there were already 3 versions of the story circulating. Dumbledore was resigning, the school was closing after Christmas, or the minister meant to appoint resident officials in each house. Fred claimed the last one with relish and nominated Percy for Slytherin on grounds of temperament. The truth, when it emerged, was both smaller and worse. Not in one announcement, but in many conversations, in posted notices and teacher expressions, and the changed tone of even ordinary instructions. The school learned that the Ministry and Board of Governors had ratified a temporary internal security charter for Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. There would be formal liaison authority on campus for the duration of the Sirius Black threat and any related security concerns. Patrol schedules would continue. Staff incident reports would now be copied directly to the minister's office. Student possessions might be inspected under faculty supervision where credible risk was established. Emergency restriction powers could be invoked by the minister in consultation with the headmaster should further breaches occur. It was all written with the brisk modesty of bureaucracy. No melodrama, no banners, just a tightening of language around a living place. Consultation, Hermione said after reading the notice twice. That's how they're doing it. They're making his consent part of the mechanism. Ron looked from her to Harry. In English? They forced Dumbledore to agree or appear reckless, Harry said. Hermione nodded. And once he agrees, they call it partnership. Ron swore under his breath with feeling. Ginny, reading over Hermione's shoulder, went very still at the line about student inspections. Harry saw the memory pass across her face and then leave only resolve behind. It was a new look on her, fragile yet fierce, as if some softer self had not died exactly but had moved aside to make room for caution with teeth. During lunch, McGonagall read a formal summary to Gryffindor House. She stood before the fire with the charter in her hands and did not attempt to soften it by much. These measures are in force, she said. They are not an invitation to panic rumor vigilantism or theatrical disobedience. You will behave with dignity. You will bring concerns to your teachers, and you will remember that no official standing in a corridor outranks your judgment about cruelty, intimidation, or improper conduct. If anyone is treated wrongly under cover of procedure, you come to me. It was perhaps the nearest thing to rebellion Harry had ever heard spoken in a school announcement. Afterward, he found himself unable to sit still. The common room felt crowded. The corridors felt worse. He wandered without purpose until purpose found him in the shape of a half-open door, leading to a spiral staircase he had climbed a dozen times for summonses and detentions and lemon drops. No summons had come today. Harry climbed anyway. He found Dumbledore on the battlements above the tower, hatless in the cold, his beard moving slightly in the wind. The lake below lay dark as hammered metal. Beyond the gates, the Dementors kept their stations among the bare trees. In the courtyard far beneath, students crossed in twos and threes like pieces on a board. Ginny was among them, a small red figure with her satchel over one shoulder, walking beside Hermione with her head bent into the winter light. "I thought I might find you here," Dumbledore said without turning. Harry hesitated only a second before stepping out beside him. Stone breathed cold through the soles of his shoes. "You knew I was coming? I suspected that your sense of justice had not improved with age." Harry shoved his hands into his pockets. "Did you sign it?" Dumbledore looked out over the grounds. "I allowed it." "That isn't the same." "No." His voice carried no self-defense. "It is not." For a while they stood in silence. From below came the muffled clang of the front gates, and farther off, the faint bark of Hagrid's dog. The castle at their backs was enormous and old and full of rooms where children did homework and whispered secrets and learned the limits of power. Harry had never before thought of it as vulnerable. Ancient, yes. Mysterious. Capable of protecting itself in ways the Ministry could never understand. Vulnerable had been for people, not places. Yet here it was, wounded not in stone but in custom. "I hate him," Harry said, surprising himself with the simplicity of it. "Cornelius Malfoy, too. All of them. They talk as if they're helping." He looked down at the courtyard where a pair of Ministry stewards crossed toward the entrance hall, notes in hand. "They make everything smaller." Dumbledore folded his hands behind his back. "Power often prefers rooms it can inventory." Harry glanced at him. "Then why let them?" The question should have sounded accusing. Dumbledore received it as grief. "Because," he said, "there are moments when refusing a hand on the door does not keep the door closed. It only changes whether the children behind it are present when it breaks." Harry frowned. "That sounds like losing politely." Dumbledore smiled then, very slightly and with no mirth in it. "There are many kinds of losing, Harry. Some preserve time. Some preserve witnesses. Some preserve the possibility that what is yielded may one day be reclaimed." He turned at last and looked directly at him. "Do not mistake compromise under duress for faith in the one who compels it." Below them, Cornelius Fudge emerged from the entrance hall, flanked by two clerks. Even at a distance, Harry could recognize his gait. Hurried, heavy with purpose, burdened by the appearance of his own responsibility. One clerk carried a dispatch box, the other a sheaf of green-sealed copies of the charter. They crossed the courtyard toward the waiting carriage as men might carry ordinances from a battlefield they did not understand. "Will it stop with this?" Harry asked. Dumbledore's eyes followed the minister only briefly before lifting again to the hills beyond the lake. Fear is seldom satisfied by the first thing it is given. Harry absorbed that in silence. He thought of Ginny at the feast, of Hermione squinting at legal phrasing until she could see the trap, of Ron's instinctive disgust, of Fred and George joking to keep from admitting anger, of McGonagall telling her house that no official in a corridor outranked their judgment. He thought of Lupin placing chocolate in his hand before questions. He thought of a castle whose walls were full of hidden ways no clipboard would ever wholly master. "What do we do?" he asked. Dumbledore's answer came almost at once. "We remember the difference between safety and obedience. We keep our mercy." We watch those who would use fear to make us smaller, and we do not help them by becoming like them. The wind shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang the quarter hour. Harry looked again over Hogwarts. From here, the changes were invisible. No decree showed from the air. No patrol schedule could be seen in the long lines of stone, or the dark, mirrored lake, or the towers lifting into winter sky. Yet he knew, as surely as he knew where his own scar lay beneath his fringe, that the place had altered. Not because officials had entered it, but because they had entered it claiming necessity, and found too many people willing to treat that claim as enough. In the courtyard, Ginny stopped and looked up as if she felt something. For a brief second, Harry thought she could see him on the battlements. Then Hermione tugged her sleeve, and she moved on. He realized with a clarity that seemed to freeze the air in his lungs that the war for a place might begin long before anybody called it one. It could begin with a frightened man in a hospital wing deciding that next time he would stand closer. It could begin with reviews, with ledgers, with emergency notices pinned near familiar doors. It could begin with one child flinching when a minister named her terror as a procedure. Below, the carriage carrying Fudge away rolled over the frosted drive. Behind it, clerks remained. Notices remained. Patrols remained. The ministry had not seized Hogwarts in a night. It had taken the older, subtler road, arriving under the banner of reassurance and staying by habit. Harry stood beside Dumbledore until the sun thinned toward afternoon, and the cold drove even thought inward. When at last he turned back toward the tower stairs, he did so with the uneasy knowledge that the castle was still home and not wholly its own. That was the new thing. Not ruin, not defeat. Occupation by inches. Fear, he understood then, did not always break down doors with a roar. Sometimes it came with wax seals, polished shoes, and a promise to keep children safe. And by the time the promise had been posted on every wall, the walls no longer sounded quite like themselves.